Hello and welcome to another episode of The Science of Psychotherapy. I'm Matthew Darlitz, Editor-in-Chief of The Science of Psychotherapy. And as always, here with Managing Editor Richard Hill.
Hello, Matt. Good to see you. This is really great. We're another one of our interesting experts with the experts talk.
That's right.
In relation to work we're doing at SOP, because we're just completing the Schizophrenia documentary. Mm-hmm. And certainly that's a part of the book. Although we were working through the book chronologically, I thought we might jump to that and have a little talk about the documentary and give people an incentive to go in and check it out.
Absolutely. Look, I've had so much fun doing this documentary series, and I'm very excited about episode number 3 on schizophrenia, and just really looking forward to doing more. We've got another couple that we're sort of halfway through the production process, and I'm really hoping that you're enjoying this series because tell you, I'm certainly enjoying doing the production. Richard, you do all of the writing and the narration. How are you finding the process?
Look, it's a fascinating process, and interestingly, with the PhD work that I'm doing on client responsiveness, where you interview and you look for current themes and relative points, that's actually what a scriptwriter does in relation to a documentary. They go through and they look for the parts that they bring together. And we had such an interesting group. I really love the balance of this one. I love all the documentaries, but this balance of the experts and those people with lived experience. So we have 4 wonderful people who are going through schizophrenia, who are talking about what it feels like in the experience, and blending that in with the explanations and the understandings and the sorts of knowledge base that our research experts bring is I think really creates a beautifully round picture.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, I thought today what we could do is just play a few clips and just have a little bit of a chat about what we're presenting. And I thought we'd start with, we went to the Queensland Brain Institute to have a chat to a couple of the researchers that are on the leading edge here when it comes to some of the causal variables, when it comes to schizophrenia. And we talked to a Professor Daryl and Dr. James Cassidy. Let's just play a little clip and then we'll have a bit of a chat.
The lateral neurons, they're the A9 dopamine neurons in the brain. They are the area that people, maybe some of your subscribers have heard about, are the neurons that will degenerate in Parkinson's disease. Lose 80% of them, you get Parkinson's disease. But these neurons project not exclusively, but primarily to an area of the brain called the dorsal striatum. That is where all the dopamine abnormalities are in schizophrenia. All of them. They're all in the dorsal striatum.
As our cameras and technology got better, we could start to see which parts of the brain in particular those things are associated with. And that was, I think, sort of a decade, 15 years ago, was sort of a breakthrough, at least in my perspective of it, of where the increased dopamine that was related with psychosis was actually located in the brain. We always thought it was this sort of motivation reward system, the limbic system, we call it, because that just made sense for like salience and misattributing things that shouldn't be relevant. They become relevant, and that can sort of induce some of the psychotic symptoms. But what it turned out to be was a little more sort of this direction of the brain, so up in what we call the associative striatum, which in a human is primarily the caudate nucleus. And what that meant was that things weren't quite as simple.
This breakthrough in understanding where the dopaminergic problem lies means that the approach to therapy and medication will have to adjust. It reminds us that we must continue to question and explore and make corrections that develops more effective treatment strategies. James Cassidy explains.
The problem with the associative striatum is it's a much more complex region. There's no very simple, if we put too much dopamine in here, we'll have this outcome with this little simple test. But it's incredibly important for all the incoming cortical information that we navigate decisions with. So all these, it's dopamine projecting to this region, but it's a whole bunch of glutamatergic inputs from various cortical regions, which are the associative cortices, hence its name. And what it does is it takes all this information, different brain areas are involved in computing different things. So, is anything changed? No. What's the best strategy we can do to this? How are we going to approach this? Is it relevant? All these things coming in, and then it sort of navigates the whole process to go, okay, how are we going to act upon this? What are we going to do? And what's our strategy moving forward? And maintains that so we can consistently make good choices. So obviously that's very complicated. So that's what we're looking at now to try and understand, so if we have too much dopamine in this region, does it impair our ability or its ability to navigate all these incoming problems from the cortex? And it gets even more sort of complex when you think about how we treat psychosis. And not all, obviously it's a very broad disorder. It's one of the problems with these severe psychiatric illnesses, especially schizophrenia, is that there's a lot going on. It's not just dopamine. There's lots of different disorders get psychosis.
So this is really, really interesting stuff, Matt.
Yeah, it is.
Now,
it is.
Now, in the academy, we've got my Dangers of Dopamine course.
Yep.
Now we're going to add these files and these sections to that course because we've got to update it. We've got to upgrade it. In that one, I was talking about what was known at the time, which was largely that it was the mesolimbic area that was getting increases in dopamine, and that there was a sort of a competition between the mesolimbic area and the nigrostriatal area, with the nigrostriatal area giving you Parkinsonian symptoms and the mesolimbic area giving you psychosis symptoms. And so if you reduced the dopamine for the mesolimbic area, you reduced dopamine in the nigrostriatal and caused Parkinsonian systems. But for Parkinsonian patients, you increased dopamine, that increased things in the limbic area that caused a psychosis, which is quite often what happens with Parkinson's patients. But although the limbic area is still relevant, although it still has pertinence because it's got a lot to do with salience, as we talk about it, it's actually the majority of it, as Daryl says, absolutely all of it is occurring in this area called the associative stratum. And then we also, it called the caudate, also called the dorsal striatum. They're all pretty much the same sort of area.
Yeah.
But this is where the abnormalities, and this is where there are increases in activity, of dopaminergic activity, that are affecting broad aspects of the brain. So I've given a sort of a layman's or sort of a practitioner's summary. We really have to get into the weeds. I've got to go back and get into that stuff with the guys, and I want to research and go to some papers and really get a grasp of it. But the most important thing is that thing of it is more than we have been saying, and it is a shift in perspective of what it is saying, but it is still dopamine.
Now, what we don't show in the 50-minute documentary, but we do have as the extended interviews with these researchers, is a whole lot of other variables. So we talk about, vitamin D and other things that are affecting the developmental trajectory of these neurons. And so to get all of that, we do have the extended interviews there's a lot more than just dopamine. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, that's important. And of course, we do have that covered nicely in sort of saying it's complex and saying there's a lot more, and saying that some people are not having dopaminergic problems, but are having or don't have dopaminergic abnormalities, but are having psychotic symptoms. So the dopaminergic systems and the frameworks, and also that it's to do with GABAergic behavior. So meaning just activity of neurons and areas of the brain and systems in the brain connecting through the thalamus. So it's this broader aspect. Please, everybody who's listening, this is just teasing and tempting you to get onto Google Scholar and go have a look at the more detail, because that's what I'll be doing. There's more to understand. But if you find that you're not so much interested in the technical detail, it is important to grasp the conceptual framework of these complexities, and that you need to be looking fundamentally at dopamine, fundamentally at the associative cortex, to some degree to the mesolimbic things, but fundamentally that there can be all kinds of issues going on, as we know, from inflammatory processes, from pandas, as we've talked about, from someone can just have a high fever and have a disruption that is causing. And if you have particular developmental structures, then you are more likely to develop something like a psychosis event. But because you have those developmental structures doesn't mean you will have one.
No, that's
this
right.
is where the other thing comes along
in
the process of understanding it.
Now, look, one of the really wonderful things that I got to do with this project was go out and talk to some people that have suffered from schizophrenia and have had a lived experience. And so we connected with 4 amazing individuals that have been, suffering from schizophrenia. And what I might do is I'll just play a little bit of a clip to introduce you to them, and then we'll have a little bit of a chat.
There's people who've turned their suffering upside down, which is what we have to do. We live with things, don't we? There's beautiful. Now, let's look at these people, glorious people.
I had my first nervous breakdown in 1999 when I started hearing things and I started feeling things that wasn't there. And my parents were just amazing in supporting me throughout my journey. So yeah, I'm very lucky. But and my family, so the rest of my family have been supportive throughout my journey. But yeah, just hearing things and feeling things that are not there, and being in a different dimension, but just being in its physicality, but being in a spiritual dimension. And I do believe there's different.
I moved out of home to Brisbane. I'm from a country town called Moree. So it's a big move interstate. And I think that would have been where the first big change happened for me with schizophrenia. So I went and saw a psychiatrist, but I guess the first thing is denial. I just tried to push past the pain and try to live a normal life.
And within a short period of time I became paranoid, delusional, had changes in weight, changes in appetite, changes in sleep, and I had a relationship breakdown. So I ended up resigning from the pulp and paper mill, going to live with a chaplain and his wife and create a suicide intervention and prevention retreat. And then Mum and Dad had to fly down to Tasmania to come and bring me back to Brisbane in late 2000 for psychiatric treatment because I gave away all my inheritance, destroyed my possessions and gave away my possessions, and thought I had to sacrifice myself for other people.
But the early onset basically was brought about by too much stress. I was going through a marriage separation. I was trying to work as much as I could. I didn't really have balance, and I basically burnt out physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually as well. And then there was a component of meaning making. I was trying to make meaning of my experience, and because I didn't really seek help, I came to my own conclusions, which escalated to psychosis. Like mania, then psychosis, and then you're believing in you're telling yourself irrational things that you believe to be true. And thankfully, it was intervened at that point through emergency services to bring me into hospital. And my experience of that has been in and out of hospital many times, particularly in the early days. But I've had to learn and understand things for my own self.
So the hospitalisations is one point. Everyone's faced hospitalisation in the past. So that feeling of being taken to hospital or going to hospital. Did you go to hospital? Yeah.
Many times.
Yeah, so there's trauma around that with the police if they're involved, or the ambulance officers in the admission. And the experience of hospital itself is not very nice. Being locked up, if it's a locked ward with over 30 other people also experiencing quite traumatic and significant mental illness at the same time, and waiting for the medication and the appropriate treatment to start working. Yeah. So there's that acute phase. Yeah. And then also there's probably some of the symptoms as well of schizophrenia, the hallucinations, the delusions of grandeur, building castles in the air, odd behaviour, behaviour that's not accepted by society in general, that's normal in that sense. And also a sense that you've lost your sense of purpose from being someone who could work or conduct yourself in the community and be an integral part of the community, maybe have a family. I know that I ended up breaking off an engagement because of my mental illness, long distance, and Ian's had a family but had a family breakdown.
Yeah, it's so compelling as you're listening to them. And what really struck me, Matt, was the extraordinary capacity for each of them to be objective.
Yeah.
They were able to. They've got a grip of this. They're not that they don't have trauma. They don't have struggles with it, but they've come to grips with it. And we talk about this in insecure attachment. That if you can tell the story, if you can form an objective sort of narrative, then of your subjective experience, then you're much stronger. You're showing you're much stronger. And these guys have and there's other dialogue too elsewhere. How they learn to decide which voice is is the good voice or the bad voice, and how they turn the voices into positive aspects of life. But it must be an extraordinarily uncomfortable. I mean, Larry Ozawa talks about this. He talks about stressful events, and he talks about the effect of it striking him, because it's very often in early teen years that you have these experiences. Yeah.
Although what was interesting about this group is that there was a number of them that onset was in adulthood, and it was a stress event that tipped them over the edge, so to speak. But they do have like you said, they do have a good grasp, a good objective grasp of what is going on, except when, of course, they're in the midst of an episode, and then their objectivity isn't there. But coming out of that, that they do have a good grasp of what is going on. They've got good support network that they've created themselves. So the three men there that you saw around the table, they have their own like a prayer group, so they're all Christians, so they support one another. They have a strong faith, and they just strike me as very resilient people, and they're getting through this in a wonderful way.
And Risa, who now works in a mental health ward, as a lived experience person, and just that extraordinary strength that she's brought to. So when somebody's in there having an episode and they're seeing pink elephants on the walls, and she's just able to say, "Oh yes, I can understand how you're seeing that. I've seen those sorts of things," and it's true and believable. We are having an increased appreciation of the value of including lived experience people into the exercise, into the therapeutic framework. I mean, like everything, there's a bit of a pendulum swing at the moment. So lived experience is better and education is, but it's in the balance in between, where the people who understand this stuff. But there was a fascinating thing you noticed with Chris, with a little goatee beard, because I'm looking at him and I was thinking, oh wow, those medications are really screwing him around.
So what we saw in the interview was maybe a little bit of stage fright as well, because he looked a little bit sort of affected when we were interviewing him. But when we got him downstairs and we were filming a bit of B-roll, and he was doing his job, making some coffees, being the barista, he opened right up, and he seemed a lot more free than he did in front of the camera. So I think part of that is a bit of stage fright in front of cameras, and that does. I have found that as we're doing these documentaries, if you stick someone in front of a camera, all of a sudden,
Yes. Well, this is quite common, and of course, people become very strange and static and slow. And of course, some of the medications may slow him down a little bit more. So that was a really interesting thing. It's not to give people, when we're working with them, a sense of context. Like, okay, they've come to you, they're sitting down for the first time. maybe it's not their medication, maybe it's not their schizophrenia, maybe it's not their depression or anxiety, it's just they're nervous.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. About meeting somebody new, particularly if they have on the shyness side of, not being scared or cautious of novelty. So there was a lot to learn from your experience with Chris and how he was on and off camera.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other sort of common thing with all of them was this ability to make meaning out of their circumstance. And so all of them commented about meaning making. One of the guys, Ian in particular, I mean, he had been a philosophy student. So, he was very keen to and very passionate about making meaning out of the circumstances that he's found himself in, and they all did, and they've all found a place where there is a satisfaction in understanding their place in the world and getting through this disorder.
And this is a really big part that psychotherapists and counsellors and psychologists can play.
Absolutely.
We know it's a psychiatric sort of issue, and we know there's sorts of areas that you've got to be very careful of. But understanding the medications, we talk about that a little bit. But Larry Ozawa who talks to us about what the therapist can do and how beneficial and helpful the therapist can be.
Yeah. Well, why don't we just play a little bit about medication? And Larry Ozawa, he talks about this very succinctly. So let me just play this little bit here.
So the treatment is crucial. The mainstay of treatment is really with antipsychotic medications. And those have been around since about the 50s or 60s, starting with medications that were heavy in terms of side effect burden, trying to come up with, from the first generation of antipsychotic medications, which had a lot of side effects around movement disorders and the like, to what we call the second generation antipsychotics, which reduced some of the first generation issues, but created issues of their own, including things like weight gain and everything that comes with that. And so over time, we've sort of moved towards the second generation antipsychotics, but like I said, they're still with considerable amount of side effects for the most part.
So one of the side effects of the medications that I take quetiapine is an increased appetite or hunger response. So that means you gain the kilograms if you eat when you feel hungry. The other challenge is with the schizophrenia is quite chronic insomnia. So that's happened in the past, and I'm suffering from it at the moment. So I take 60 milligrams of oxazepam, and it takes about 4 hours to go to sleep from taking the oxazepam at 8:30. So I'm just lying in my bed practicing mindfulness. And some nights, like last night, I had a great sleep. I got to sleep at 11, woke up at 4, went to the toilet, and then broken sleep until 8 o'clock. So for me, that was a great night. Other nights, I might only get 2 hours or none at all.
Well, mainly my side effects are drowsiness and dizziness. So I sort of look like I'm falling asleep all the time. And my family said that, yeah, I look like I'm just falling asleep, and because I'm always drowsy, so I couldn't drive. And I gain a lot of weight because that's like normal side effect, and brain fog as well sometimes. So.
There's one drug called clozapine, which is kind of like a wonder drug in schizophrenia. It's a very bad drug for its side effects, which is why it's limited in its use. And it was developed, or sort of discovered in the 60s. But for some reason, about half of those remaining people, it really helps, where no other drug does. But then obviously we still have that remaining portion that doesn't respond to any drug we have currently. And some of the work coming out now suggests that maybe that group of people who have schizophrenia but that don't respond to our anti-dopamine typical drugs, maybe don't have the same dopamine problems. So what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that that area isn't important. It means that other things are going on that might contribute to the same phenotype we see in psychosis. So I think in that case, a lot of the research suggests that it's not necessarily just too much dopamine going to this region. It might be more broad, sort of low-level dysfunction in a lot of regions. And the cumulative effect of that is that same response as simply just putting too much dopamine in there.
Yeah, fabulous. I mean, what they are, I often say that when you look at the medications that somebody's taking, it's first of all, you learn a bit about the client. You learn something about the client and how they're being regulated by these medications. But you're also learning about their treating therapist, their treating psychiatrist or doctor, as to what the doctor or the psychiatrist is thinking. And that's really important because, there's always contention between them and difference of opinion. Yeah. But I found it enormously helpful, and we've got some other stuff in the academy about this. I think in the Dangers of Dopamine talk. So that's a really important thing for us to understand. And Larry was very succinct.
Absolutely. Well, look, this is such a fascinating area, and once again, I had so much fun doing this episode for our Science of Us documentary series. And so I really hope that you will jump across to the Academy, the scienceofpsychotherapy.net. If you're not a member, certainly, we'd love for you to be a member. And in the show notes here, I'll put a direct link to this particular episode. And I do hope that you enjoy listening to it. And if you want some CEU points, actually going through the extended interviews as well.
Yes, and certainly if you're not a member, you can purchase this one off, just a small fee to cover things, a few dollars. And but the best thing is the extended interviews and the CEU certificate, which you can really, I think, hold up proudly, because we get a lot. Psychotherapists and counselors get a lot of people who have schizophrenic and psychosis issues, both recognized and yet to be recognized. So it's a really important area for us to be aware of, particularly if you're working, say, with homeless people. That's one example where these are major issues for you to have some sensitivity towards.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone, once again for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye for now.